Hello, everybody. Hope you enjoy the film. And with us, we have Sian Heder, the writer and director of CODA. This film, if you guys didn't know, it won at Sundance Film Festival 4 awards, which I think it's a history making. It won an Audience Award, it won the Directing Award, and the Grand Jury Prize, and a special award for deservedly for the ensemble. Thank you for being here, Sian.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I want to jump in and talk to you about the cinematography. I was really struck about your approach, where how sensitive when the framing and the composition was always sensitive to the ASL language. And like, we're used to seeing people being shot from the back, seeing their backs, but you were very careful to show us in the composition, as I said, the ASL. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes. I mean, my cinematographer, Paula Huidobro, and I have worked together for many years. We met as students at AFI, and she shot my first short film ever. So we have a long history with each other. And I think our approach whenever we're going into a project is really organic, and it's always coming from the story and what we feel like the story is wanting the camera to do. And like you said, it was interesting to start looking at these ASL scenes because, normally as a director, if you're blocking a scene, someone can walk out of a room and throw a line over their shoulder, or a door slams, or they're looking, or they're doing something else while they're talking. But when you're conversing in ASL with someone, you are really planted and looking right at the person and, directly communicating face to face. And that was interesting to approach, from a blocking standpoint and then from a cinematography standpoint. So Paula and I spent a lot of time in rehearsal watching the actors and really figuring out, how we could keep everyone's hands in frame, because obviously as a director, one of the things you rely on is a close-up, and
Right.
we never want to go into a close-up because you'd be cutting out the hands, and that's cutting out the language. And so a lot of it was really playing with like how we could use the camera to, still be visually dynamic, still be alive in those scenes, but respecting the language and making sure that signs were always in frame. And sometimes it was interesting. We would figure out that like we could put a camera over someone's shoulder if they just signed higher, because you can actually read the sign,
Oh,
from
wow.
behind if their hands were up here, or, it was just really fun to work with my actors. And I had my ASL master. I had two ASL masters who were kind of my directors of ASL, who were on set with me. And Anne Tomasetti, who was by the monitor with me every step of the way in those ASL scenes. I remember really playing with her, sometimes with the signs, sometimes to go like, well, this is the shot I really want. Is there a way to sign this in frame or to have this moment? So I love what we made, and I think in this case, Paula was able to capture the beauty of this town, the visuals in this town, which is this combination of being very, New England quintessential, these vistas and this rocky seashore, but also the grit of the town and the reality. And we really tried to kind of stay out of the way with the camera and like let the actors and the language take center stage.
You also do, it struck me, there is a beautiful scene with Leo at the bar where he's listening to this very fast dialogue, and the camera makes us understand his perspective. Can you talk about directing in that scene in particular, really so resonant?
I love these questions. I love talking about this part of the filmmaking because, that was a scene that originally I had thought maybe I would play with sound, there not being sound in that scene as well. And then that ended up being something that I wanted to hold off till later. But it was really important to me, from hearing from my deaf friends about their experiences, whether it's growing up in hearing families and sitting at the Thanksgiving table with a bunch of hearing people and trying to follow a conversation and what that actually feels like, which is quite exhausting. read someone's lips and you catch one line and then someone laughs across the table and you realize a joke was made and you look over to catch the joke and you miss the next thing, or someone's holding food in front of their mouth as they're talking and you can't read their lips. And so Anne Tomasetti and Danielle Durant, had written me both very beautiful descriptions of what that felt like. And I said, can you just really train of thought, like walk me through what that's like to be sitting at a table with a bunch of hearing people. And I gave that piece of writing, which was quite beautiful, that Anne wrote for me, to Paula, my DP. And usually, she's not operating, the camera operators are operating for her. And in that scene, she said, well, I really need to operate, now that I've read this, I need to operate the camera and be in this perspective. And so she really operated the camera using what Anne had written me about being a detective and finding clues and looking, somebody laughs and you catch the laugh, and then someone brings up their beer right when they're saying something and covers their mouth and you miss the line. And I love what she did in that moment, because there's a moment too where the camera kind of tunes out and she just watches a woman talking across the bar for a moment and then watches the tab on his beer. And it's really lovely, because I think these moments where you can actually get into the deaf perspective as a hearing person are very valuable in a story like this.
A similar question, and now it has to do with the score. I was very in tune to the pun intended, to the fact that the score doesn't lead the emotion, that the storytelling and the visuals are very at the forefront. Can you tell us about that approach and working with your composer?
Well, Marius DeVries and I, when we sat down to talk about scoring the movie, usually in a dialogue scene, the audience is listening to the dialogue, and therefore the score is almost like a pad that comes up that supports the dialogue or supports the emotion. When you have these ASL silent scenes, the moment you put music into them, the music is the most powerful thing, because I think as a hearing audience, people are uncomfortable in the silence, and it's almost like their brains are searching for what to grab onto. And the moment we put score in those scenes, the score really overwhelmed the performance and the acting and the language on screen. And so we really took it out. We kept kind of putting it in and then going, you know what? No, like these scenes need to live in silence. And also there are so many beautiful, intimate sounds in an ASL scene that they aren't silent. You hear a clothes rustle. If you say excited, you're sort of wrestling against your clothes. If you are really angry, your hands are hitting each other, slapping together, and there's vocalizations and all these breath and interesting sounds. And so I really was like to my sound designers, go capture those sounds. And I remember the sound guy putting a lav on Marlee Matlin. And she was like, why are you loving me? No one ever loves me. And I'm like, because you're making, all sorts of expressive sounds as in the middle of a scene. And I want to capture that. So Marius and I and Nick Baxter, like we all kind of work together to let the score always follow the emotion, never lead the scene. When it does come in occasionally in ASL scenes, which is always right at the end of the scene, it's way after the emotion has happened. It's sort of when you're already in the mode of the scene and the score almost comes in. And it was a very minimal score as well, because it was kind of needed to pair with these long silent scenes. And how do you support that with music as opposed to taking over the scene with the music? So I think Marius did an amazing job. Yeah. It was not an easy task. And, I kept going, nope, less score, and then the moments that we do have score, I think are really impactful because they're so careful.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason why I want to ask all these questions is because I think you make it look very simple. And when you watch the film, there was so much care put into the whole filmmaking. Am I wrong to assume that the first third of the film, there is no score whatsoever, right? We live in
very little. I mean, the first score piece starts, I think there's a little bit, I don't even know if it's still in there, when she's walking through the woods, which is deep into the, it's like so the first third of the movie, I would say, has no score at all. I love the choir scenes, actually, because I think in the edit, my editor, Giraud Brisson, and I had so much fun, I think, playing with the balance between silence and these very energetic choir scenes. And I think it was also playing with the audience, slowly easing an audience, hearing audience into the rhythm of ASL and into the rhythm of watching these silent scenes. And we were careful in the first third of the movie, especially to make sure that there was a balance between dialogue scenes and music scenes and these ASL scenes. And in a way, you're carefully walking your audience into this world and letting them get comfortable. And then, by the end of the film, I think there are 5 ASL scenes in a row, which have no dialogue. But at that point, the audience is invested in the characters and in this family. And I don't know that people notice that they're even sitting in silence anymore. So I loved that it was kind of the experience of normalizing the ASL and putting you in the world of this family and getting an audience comfortable. So once it starts to feel like your family, hopefully people kind of forget that they're watching this other language.
And then there's also, you mentioned all the sounds that are made as they communicate with one another, but there's also a musicality in the movement itself, which is very powerful.
Well, and it's funny, when I started the process, CODA has this double meaning in that it's child of deaf adults, and it's the term for this role. But it's also obviously represents the end of a piece of music, which felt very fitting. And in a way,
the end of her childhood too.
The end of her childhood, and it's a coda in a piece of music sort of sums up the music, and it also completes it, and it allows the music to finish. And so in a way, this is a story about a kid, that moment in life where you have to kind of say goodbye to your childhood identity. And there's a certain amount of grief in that, but also closure and all of that. But what's beautiful, when I really started studying ASL and getting into the language, it is so musical, ASL. I mean, it is expressive in a way that spoken language is not. It's rhythmic, it's melodic, it has a kind of heightened emotion that I don't think words can get at, because there's a way you use your face, your eyebrows, the space, your space around your body when you're telling a story, and you have to live in what you're saying, because there isn't past or future tenses. You're telling everything present tense, and then you're putting it in the future, you're putting it in the past. So it's incredibly musical. And there were so many connections I found between the language and music. And I love the scene where Ruby is asked to describe how she feels when she sings. And the only way to describe it is through ASL for her, because it is the only thing that is as expressive as the feeling. So it was a cool thing. And it's something that I continue, I'm still studying and learning ASL, but I think the language itself, there are just so many connections between those two languages.
Tell us about the audition scene where she beautifully sings both sides now. And there is the connection between singing and the ASL. Tell us about I don't know if choreographing is the right word, but coming up with the combination of visual expressions and the song itself.
Yeah, the beauty of ASL is that in a way, there is a certain amount of choreography and creativity that can happen within the language itself too. There's not one sign for each thing. There are many ways to express any given line. So when I was working through the translation of the script with Alexandria Wales, who was my ASL master, we sat across the table from each other and we would, talk about a line of dialogue. It wasn't like she would read it and could just give me a translation of the line. I would talk to her about what my intention was and what I wanted the actor's emotional state to be and what they were getting at. And then we would work on sign choices. It could be this, or it could be this, or maybe we go with this. And Alexandria is a dancer and started as a dancer. And so I think also she's a very creative person and has a real understanding of ASL and the language. So when it came to the songs and finding sign choices to, you're not just trying to express the literal lyrics, which Joni Mitchell's lyrics in Both Sides Now are beautiful, but there are concepts within the lyrics that you're trying to express. And so what was fun about the way she approached the song was we would look at a lyric and then we would go, but what does the lyric mean? Because a lot of the lyrics are metaphors, they're not literally saying, they're talking about things representing other things. So there's I remember there's a part where she sings, don't give yourself away. And Alexandria did this thing where she kind of opened her own chest and let this thing come out and then pulled it back, at the last minute into her chest. And that was what that lyric felt like to me. It's not just, you could sign actually give yourself away, but that's not the feeling. The feeling is opening up those secret important parts of yourself and holding on to those for you. So I love what she did with the song, and it was very hard for Amelia to sign and sing at the same time. I think she was new to singing. And so that was a very vulnerable thing for her to do. And then to be signing on top of it. And I remember, she talks about that as being the hardest scene in the film for her, but it's so powerful. And in a way, I love that, in that moment, the need to communicate with her parents is more important than a perfect vocal for her audition. And we were recording everything live on set in terms of the singing. And I kept telling Amelia, this is about communicating with your family. At this point, you don't give a shit about your Berkeley audition. This is about them. And as a result, her vocal performance is very emotional and connected as well.
Yeah. And I love the choice of song because it speaks about the fact that she's living in two worlds. And that's part of the beauty of the film, that we see the conflict of Ruby having to straddling those two worlds.
And I love that, Joni Mitchell, that was that was on her first album. I think she didn't even write it for herself. She wrote it for Judy Collins, I think, but she talks about that song as marking the end of her childhood, that it was a moment where adult fantasy hits up, your childhood fantasy hits up against adult reality. And she recorded it when she was in her 20s and just embarking on her career. And then you listen to that recording and you listen to the recording she did when she was 65. And
correct.
And it's just, the song completely has transformed because she's transformed and she's lived a life and had grief and regret and all these things. And that's imbued into the song. And so I also love that the song itself, while it was about the CODA experience, also seemed to be about these journeys that we're on in life and the way we change, and even our own identity, something that you created as an artist when you were 22 can completely transform when you reapproach it in your 60s. So that history to the song was a very cool element as well.
I want you to expand something that you mentioned, and is the fact that you work with Alexandra Wells as your director of ASL, and you were talking about putting the dialogue that you had written onto the screen. Can you walk us through that? So you wrote the script, and then Alexandra came in to help you interpret the spoken language that you had written into. Is that?
Yes.
Could
so
you?
There's no written form of ASL. So in the way, the way you would write a scene, I've written scenes where somebody's speaking another language and you send off that scene and you get it back, from a translator and in that language, but there was no version of that. And so it was a process of Alexandria, and I had two directors of, and it's called the Director of Artistic Sign Language intentionally, because it's not just American Sign Language. They are making artistic choices. So what I loved is that process was such a wild process as a writer, because I think as a hearing person and as someone who's a writer, and I started out as an actor, so I think I hear all the lines of dialogue in my head when I'm writing them, and I'm sort of playing every character as I'm writing the script. And there was a moment when I realized, oh, I'm never going to hear these lines of dialogue. Like I'm actually going to watch my words. And what a cool thing that is as a writer, to kind of watch this visual representation of a joke, or of a highly emotional moment. And so that was a process to find what that was. And as I was working with Alexandria, I remember, in terms of sign choices, there were lines that I'd written where she would sign back to me and we would kind of discuss, I think Ruby had a line like, do you want me to die here? And I remember Alexandria signing it for me. And die is like a very kind of passive. I mean, it's not passive. You can actively do it, but it didn't feel like that actor in that moment would the right sign. And so you're killing me. Like killing is like a very active, angry sign. And so I was like, oh, maybe the line is, you're killing me with this. And so a lot of it was that, and playing with the language, and then also playing with regionalisms, because this is a fishing family in Gloucester, Massachusetts. There are local signs, just like there's a Boston accent. So, learning what are the local signs, like what's the sign for the town of Gloucester? Like Gloucester has a sign name, which is this, but people outside of Gloucester don't know that that's the sign name for Gloucester until you're there.
And then you also have all this fishing terminology as well.
Oh my God. That was wild too, because yes, and the types of fish. And I remember we all had different names for the fish, the monkfish, which is this crazy looking fish. If any of you have ever seen a monkfish, Daniel called them ugly fish. Like that was his sign for them. Troy had this whole sign where he did like the little angler thing that hangs off so it was like working with the local fishermen who actually use signs out on the boat. So a lot of times they have a sign for stop the winch, where they're signing to each other because those boats are really loud and you can't hear each other over the engine. When there's two guys working on deck, they're using signs a lot. So it was fun to kind of be out there in rehearsal with those guys as Troy and Daniel were learning to fish. And like looking at like, what were the signs the local fishermen were already using, hearing guys, what were the signs Troy and Daniel felt like would be their kind of familial signs for these different things. And so the script was really a fluid process, the jokes, like figuring out how a joke works in sign language. I mean, Troy is such a character and is so funny. And that doctor's office scene, the stuff that he was pulling out in that scene, with like the lobster and then dropping it in the pot, the thing coming. I mean, we were in stitches. Like there were moments where I was like, Troy, walk it back. This is too far. We're going to, MPA is going to like rate this movie X or whatever based on your sex talk scene. But like, it was just a very fluid, interesting collaboration when we were on set to have, my deaf actors, to have Anne and Alexandria, to have, my own personal, like, this is kind of what I want. And at that point I'd been studying enough sign that I felt like I could intelligently make decisions about, the language. Obviously I wasn't fluent at all, but I was sort of knew enough that I could discuss, like, I think there might be another way to say this. So it was interesting. It was really a beautiful process, and man, dirty jokes work way better in language than they do in English.
Tell us we were talking about the ground fishing, and the scenes are so authentic. All of the actors seem to be so dexterous in doing the fishing. And on top of that, I know a little bit about ground fishing. It has to happen about 3 miles out in the ocean. And tell us about the difficulties of having to shoot out 3 miles deep into the ocean.
So when I was going to shoot in Gloucester, Massachusetts, I reached out to Kenny Lonergan, who was a friend of a friend, because I knew he'd shot Manchester by
Manchester. Yeah.
And I was like, tell me about crew. Like, who do I stay away from? Who do I hire? And he said, if you hire one person, hire this guy, Joe Borland, as your Marine coordinator, because our, days at sea were the best days that we had in our whole shoot. So I met with Joe really early on when I was still trying to get the movie going. And he looked at the script and he said, couldn't these guys be lobstermen? Because ground fishing is like really hard to shoot. Like, you have to go fishing in order to shoot this. And you're not going to take a crew like deep out to sea and actually fish, are you? And I was like, well, that would be cool, wouldn't it? And he was like, this is kind of insane, but like, if you're really committed to do it, like, we'll figure out a way to do it. And what I loved, it's so visual, right? Like those giant nets coming up, and the drama of like, you never know what your catch is going to be. And that net could come up and it could come up empty, or it could come up full of fish. And like, we were having that same drama, as we were shooting, because we never knew what was going to come up. So, but it was such a process. I had to find a real captain who had that boat, the Angela Rose, and I had to convince him to these guys are like closed off Gloucester fishermen. Like, who are you? We don't care about movies. Like, I fish alone, get off my deck, don't touch my boat. But I convinced Paul to take me out fishing with him. And, he said, all right, you can come down to the docks. You can meet me at 3 a.m. And I was like, oh my God, I'm meeting this guy at 3 a.m. down on the docks. Like, is he going to murder me? Like, can I go fishing with him? And I went out fishing with him and saw the process, and it was so cinematic and exciting. And so then it was a process where I took Amelia, Troy, and Daniel. They came out with the local guys, and these guys are, they're just like these rough guys who are fishing. They're used to being out on the water alone. They're like, you want me to teach a guy to fish? You want me to teach an actor to fish? And then it was like, oh, and they're deaf. Like, you want me to teach a deaf actor to fish? Yeah, I do actually. And Troy and Daniel were totally game. And we all went out and they worked it out, and they learned how to run that boat. Troy teased Daniel a lot because Troy was like just great at it right away. He would hook the doors and pull up the thing and tie all the right knots, and Daniel couldn't tie the knot, and Troy would give him a lot of shit, and Daniel would go home and practice with his phone cord all night and come back the next day and be like, I can tie this knot. But they were great, and they really learned how to do it and run that boat. And then those fishing days, we took this like 7 boats. We had a crane on a 50-foot techno on a camera boat. We had our picture boat. We had a whale watch boat that had the crew on it. And it was like setting sail, to go out to sea. And the crew that was left behind would be on the dock, like, goodbye guys, like, hope you have good weather. And, the only way to get from boat to boat was to jump, with a wait for the waves to align and then jump from boat to boat. So it was super, hardcore and really fun. And it was, we had to have a minimal crew on the boat. So we almost were shooting documentary style.
Wow.
There was no way to really light and you have interpreters standing in like, piles of fish up to their calves and hanging on for dear life as the boat's rocking back and forth. So it was very dramatic and very fun. And I love this fishing scenes in the film.
Yeah. Casting Ruby, the role as written, this young lady has to know how to do ASL, has to sing, and then also learn how to fish. How difficult was to find Amelia?
Really difficult. And my casting director, Deb Aquila, who I just adore, but she was like, Sean, you're looking for a unicorn here. Like, this is a unicorn. And I'm like, great. I bet there's a unicorn out there. Like let's keep looking. And, we had seen like maybe 100 girls. And I, at one point thought, am I just going to have to compromise in one of these areas? Maybe this is not going to be all of these things. I really wanted someone high school age too. I hate in movies when you're watching a 25-year-old play high school, because there's something about the quality of an actual teenager that you feel that very precarious age where you're kind of between child and adult. So we were right at the end of kind of our casting run. And I thought I had found my girl. And then I remember Deb called me up and said, I have this tape. You have to watch this girl. I think she's your Ruby. And I watched her audition, and she was incredibly connected and felt like this girl from a town, who was going out on a fishing boat every morning with her dad. And then I heard her sing, and her voice honestly gave me goosebumps when I heard it the first time. And she was totally untrained as a singer, but just had this incredible tone to her voice. And then she had to sign a scene for her audition, and she had nobody working with her. I had a deaf friend record the signed scene and just sent her that, and she learned off it. And then I showed her tape to a bunch of people in the community who were like, you know what, she's got great rhythms. She's picked it up really quickly, and her, expression and the way she uses her body feels like a natural signer. And so she worked hard, man. She studied for 9 months, with a deaf coach in Toronto who was teaching her about deaf culture and teaching her ASL, and wouldn't let her speak. She couldn't speak during her lesson. She had to sign back even any questions she had about what she was doing, and with a vocal coach who was working to open her voice. And she went out in rehearsal to learn to fish. And then she was doing an American accent on top of everything else, because I went out and found a British girl. So, I can't say enough about Amelia. She was a kid. She was 17, and I've never seen anybody work so hard.
Yeah. And then she makes the fishing scenes look like she's been doing this for forever.
Oh, she was badass on the boat. I mean, I watched her. I'm not squeamish about that stuff, but I watched Amelia just like grab a fish, gut it, throw the guts over her shoulder. She'd just be watching the captain of the boat do it, and she would just kind of, okay, and then she'd follow along and just be doing it, and just not, nothing, about kind of, oh God, I feel sick, or these fish are gross, or any of the stuff that you imagine, an actress might bump on. There was nothing to that. And then she really became a family with Troy and Daniel and Marley. And Troy has a CODA daughter himself, and he was away from his daughter, who was about the same age as Amelia, and Amelia was away from her family and her dad. And so I think there were bonds that came up in the film that were real, and when we finished the movie, I remember Daniel's last day, we wrapped his last shot, and people were just sobbing, and that hug that happens at the end of the movie was happening on set, and no one wanted to say goodbye or let go. So in a way, we became a real family. And I think that's something that you can feel on screen, maybe because it's not something as a director you can really create, in the way that it did, where there was something magic that happened with this cast where they bonded in a very, very intense way.
And there was no doubt ever that deaf actors needed to play this family, correct?
Not in my mind. I mean, to me, it would be such a missed opportunity, creatively, to have that kind of authentic lived experience imbue these characters, and the freedom that we had on set for those actors to play and improvise and have unscripted, beautiful moments that were coming out of, being in their own language and communicating the nuances of their own culture. And I'm a hearing person coming to this project, and I was an outsider to this community. I would never have been able to tell this story without having deaf collaborators in front of the camera and behind the camera. I don't think, regardless of whose story is whose to tell, it's a bigger thing, which is that the depth and the authenticity and the opportunity I discovered in these moments with having these collaborators, and what we were able to create because of that deep knowledge of this lived experience, I think was so invaluable to me. And I really came to it knowing what I didn't know, and being like, okay, I'm open, and here we are. And we're, whether it was like, we're setting up the furniture in the house, my production designer and Ann Tomasetti walks onto the set and goes, guys, no deaf family is ever going to set up their furniture like this. The couch needs to be here, and you would never put that in front of a window because you'll be in silhouette, and no deaf person wants to ever be in silhouette because you need to see, their faces and their hands. And so all of those moments, I think, were just moments that enriched the story in ways that I never could have done on my own.
And Sian, there is we have talked about the specificity of the story, and the specificity of the location as well. And there is such a universality to the experience of watching your film, even though I am not a deaf person. I am not a fisherman, et cetera, et cetera. Did you always understood that in that specificity, you would find universality in your audience?
I think that's always the key to a story that resonates with people. I think it's interesting that there ever is a push to make things more general in order to make them more universal. I think the specificity and those details is what ultimately makes people connect to a story and invest in a story. And, you know, especially looking at representation of characters that aren't often represented on screen. And when that representation gets harmful is when it is general, you know, when it's like, you know, oh, this is a deaf person's experience. It's like, well, there's a million deaf experiences just in the way that there's a million any, you know, hearing experiences or human experiences. And so the specificity of not just, you know, deaf culture, but this family's culture and the fact that they are from, you know, this Italian Gloucester fishing community and they're working class and they have, you know, their own flaws and, you know, idiosyncrasies as characters and as a family, and individuating every character in the family that's really on their own journey. I mean, Leo has a vastly different experience than his parents and is incredibly frustrated with this dynamic that they've set up, which he feels like is codependent. And I love the scene on the beach where he's like, go, like, we were fine before you, we'll be fine after you, like, get out of here. So yeah, I think that specificity is really key. And I've found that in all my work, you know, writing on Orange is the New Black for 3 years. It's like that show did so much to kind of launch like prison reform and looking at prisoners as people. And the reason it did is because those characters were really specific. And in their specificity, they felt relatable and real. And therefore, people were like, oh, I can kind of see myself in that person. Oh, maybe prisoners are people. Maybe we should care about them. And, right. You know, Little America is a show that I show run on Apple. And it's the same thing. It's like humanizing the immigrant experience and looking at like, this is not one experience, but in the specificity of this culture, whatever culture we happen to be looking at, and this one human journey that doesn't even represent that whole culture, is just one lived experience. I think that's what creates empathy. And I think movies are the best tool for empathy that we have right now, because if you can watch a story, you know, on TV or movies and you take the ride and you cry with the character and you laugh with the character, suddenly you're connecting to somebody that might be very different from you, who you might not encounter in your own life. And it opens us up as people.
Beautifully said. One last question. Marlee Matlin, Academy Award winner. She's a legend. What was it like working with Miss Matlin?
Marlee Matlin. I love her. That's her sign name. Marlee is a legend. You know, she's a legend in the deaf community. She's a legend as an actress. You know, she's the youngest person to ever win an Oscar, and
21.
You know, yeah. The only deaf person to ever win an Oscar. And, you know, and yet I don't think she's had the career that she should have had, because I think her roles have been limited. You know, she has all kinds of stories about opportunities that kind of were either taken away or not given because she's deaf. And so I think, you know, when I first met with her, she was so in touch with this character in this story. And I remember her saying to me, like, I haven't felt this way about a project since Children of a Lesser God. Like, I have to do this movie. I have to play this part. And she's also hilarious. And we had a lot of fun. And she's such a mama bear on set. I mean, she was cooking dinners for everybody on the weekend. She's a great cook. She was like chasing me around with food because I tend to not eat on set. I'm too focused. And she's like, what if you haven't eaten? Have a snack, like, you know, get some nourishment in your body. And so, you know, I love Marlee. I just love her. I think she's a force. And I'm so excited for her, because I do think, you know, people underestimate her talent and her ability to play, you know, all kinds of roles.
Yeah. Well, speaking of love, I loved CODA. And I loved chatting with you.
Yeah, that's a great conversation. I really appreciate your questions.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. And I know that the best is yet to come for you. Can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much. It was really fun. And thank you to everyone who came to see the movie. I wish I was in person sitting in the theater with you.
Yeah. Well, all the best. Thank you, okay. Sean. Bye.
Bye.